So if you go with the whole idea that what drama consists of is change. There is no drama without change. Change in many, many different ways, in behavior, in energy mainly. You have the word change cushioned and rewritten in many different ways. You can call it arc, you can call it movement, as I said, you can call it energy, but drama is change. And what is rewriting other than change? It is the most fundamental change that a writer faced. You have worked for months or for years to put together a first pass of ideas down. Sometimes it comes from the gut, sometimes it comes because it's an assignment. But in any case, you've poured out whatever you got. And here comes this moment where you have to attack your first major rewrite. Not the cosmetic rewrites that we all do along the way just to clarify what we're doing at this moment, but the moment where you really have to step back and say, what the hell have I been doing, and does this work? Does this really, really work? And it's a huge moment of change for the writer, because what we are asked to do, in a way, is doing two contradictory things at the same time. We are asked to look at our work and say, how does that communicate to the world? So we are asked to be aware of the audience in a very, very active way. At the same time, we are asked to jump into the character and create an emotional consistency for the piece, which actually means exactly the opposite. You have to become incredibly aware of the internal works of the piece. And it's a very challenging moment. And the only real way of handling it is to trust the power of the character, and to trust the power of the emotional truth of the character. If you're able to follow that through, then the actions are going to follow, and then the emotional clarity for the people on the other end of the table, the people reading the piece, is going to be much, much easier to be grasped. So knowing that, now comes the issue of technique. And there are two big stages of rewriting. There is the clarifying the intent stage of the rewriting, and there is the execution part of the rewriting. The clarifying the intent part of the rewriting has to happen, and I'm sure you're all going through it right now, in terms of what do I mean, what do I want, what am I trying to get out. Then comes the even harder part of, okay, once the intention is clear, does that come across? And are there issues that the piece is dealing at that moment? So the moment you trust your intent, you have to allow yourself to doubt your execution. So again, of course, it's a very challenging moment. And what we're going to do is we're actually going to use this moment and examine Children of Men, which the draft is at exactly that stage that we're going to look at. I don't really know how far back from the production it's dated, but it looks like a very early draft to me. And however, the thematics of the piece are all there, and the major plot and premise is all there. What is tremendously in trouble is the character. And we will identify together where those issues are, and of course how they get resolved in the piece. So some of you have seen the film, correct? So what are the major thematic issues that the film deals with? It's a film about life and death, correct? It's a hope, right? And it's a film, the character's movement, the character's thematic movement is a movement of awakening, correct? So it starts from a man who is locked down and he transcends. It is, a Rick, huh?
Sacrifice.
Sacrifice, yeah, to some extent. Through the awakening comes the potential of sacrifice, exactly. And there is a healing. There's a healing element. If he can heal, he can take care of the situation, even in detriment to himself. Then there is healing with himself. So then you start with a character who is sort of like a Rick in Casablanca. I need to survive. I don't give a damn about anybody. And you get to that place of life is not worth living unless you really live it in regard to the people around you and in connection with the people around you. So all of that is clear in the draft, and the main plot of this society in 2024, I believe, in London, the world is infertile. It's been infertile for 18 years. It's coming apart because there's a lot of violence since there's nothing to hope for. And here comes this man who has basically given up on life and given up on himself. There's a sense that he has a personal tragedy that has even augmented the emotional experience that he's having. And he has one lovely friend who's sort of keeping him alive on some level because he's providing a zest of life, and he's the zest of life of the film. And here comes the inciting incident. The guy gets kidnapped, and it turns out that it is his former wife, part of a rebel group that has kidnapped him. And here comes the call to adventure. She comes back to life. He has thought of her dead all these years. They were activists together. Now she's come back to life. She's asking him on a metaphorical level to come back to life, creating the complications of the film. So the setup is very clear in the pages, the thematics are very clear. So let's take a look at what the issues are. And I would say that for you, as you look through this draft, but also as you take this whole conversation that we're having and apply it to your drafts, try to remember sort of a golden rule of three big things. You have to try, and it's all about trust, because we have to trust our instincts while we undo this piece. This process is a process of discovery, but also of huge trust. So you have to trust in the power of change, because if change is not present in the story, nothing is going to happen, and you're going to lose your audience. So allow it to be there, and do not hold back or detach from the power of it and the difficulty of it, psychological or logistical. Trust the emotional truth of the piece. If the emotional truth of the character is there, they're going to tell you the steps that are true, and then thus your audience is going to stay connected. And trust the image. Trust the image and the use of the image, and lift the piece off the language. If theme and character are the two things that really tie a piece together, theme lives in images. It does not live in language. No one really can tell you what a film is about, but the way that the situation unfolds and the images chosen will tell you what the film is about. So if you keep those three things in mind, it helps clarify a little bit the whole process of making decisions. So let's take a look at the draft. So starting with the opening, always a crucial thing. We're going to run through verbally through the draft, identifying issues, and then we're going to go and watch. So bear with the repetition. Hopefully, it will sear some things in your brains, because there is variation. Trust me. So the opening scene, as I said, always important to be quite aware of what you're putting down on the page. Part of the opening is supposed to put the audience in the mood of a world. In a mood of a world, and in a mood of a thematic lineup of issues. And in this particular case, we also have the introduction of the main character. So what do we have? We have a TV voice, which immediately starts talking about the world. The TV voice by itself is an element of the world at large. And you have a coffee shop where there's a lot of men and women sitting glued to the screen while they're listening to this huge crisis in everybody's life. What has happened is the youngest person on the planet has been killed, has been murdered, and everything is up for grabs. We learn a lot of information about who this person is. We learn that there's a cult of celebrity around him. And as we learn all that, and the whole world is mesmerized by the TV, in comes introduction of our character, Theo, who is completely in opposition of all of that. He doesn't give a damn. You know, if you had a line at that moment, that would be his line. And he cuts right through, gets to the counter, gets his coffee. He gets a black coffee, no frills. He has his exact change, no interaction, in and out, while we keep hearing about the world being turmoil, about the celebrity status of this youngest person who has died. And we get a sense of violence, because not only was he murdered, but the person who murdered him was lynched afterwards. So we are quite clear that there is this sense of violence in the world. And we also end with a sense of stakes, meaning that the way that this dead person is eulogized is by giving the exact length of his life up to minutes. And just by that choice, which is an interesting and precise choice, you get a sense that this is pretty serious, because you haven't really heard of anybody being eulogized down to the minute of their death. So moving on really quickly, just to take a glance at the outline. The way that you would want to abstract this scene would be, and bring it down to a short little outline level, would be to really call on what is crucial for the scene. There's a lot of details, if you look at the way that the draft runs, but you kind of want to highlight for yourself as a writer, pretending you're writing this outline, the really crucial elements, which is that there is a hopelessness, which is that there has been the murder of the youngest person, that the introduction of the character really highlights him as an outsider and as a detached element of this world, and that the violence and the direness of the situation leaves him untouched. And you kind of want to mark that for yourself, even being a little bit overdone or pedantic, just to make sure that you emotionally know how you move this person into the world of the scene and how you leave the scene with him, so that you stay emotionally connected by forcing yourself to put down the fact that he's not touched by anything that is going on in the cafe. Now, moving on to the second scene, complicating the situation, he leaves the world, and we get an extra little touch of character, which is that he is taking his coffee and he stops a few steps away from the cafe and he pours in some whiskey from a flask. He has a flask on his body. So his detachment gets one step further. We have branded him as a detached character by his behavior in and out, and now here comes the little flask action underlining that. The world is described in quite a detail. Once we get to the film, you'll see that it's done much faster, but it's basically a world in decay. It's a world that is embodying the thematics of the film. It's falling apart. It's almost dead. Trying to survive its last years. And as he's putting as he's using the flask in his coffee, comes the big bomb that shatters the world of the cafe, brings out the victims, and brings the violence close to him. So far, so good. We will see there's always an issue of how to get across information that is necessary for the piece, but it is a bit too much because there's so many details there. And one of those issues comes in this first scene, the way that the TV voiceover is used. It's all interesting stuff, but I would like you to question and look at it carefully. How much of that do you really need? And we will see how the film treats the same issue. So the elements that the TV voiceover covers are there, but they're done much more economically. We'll see how. So the world has been shaken, our character has been close to danger, he has survived. And then the next thing, of course, comes the question where, what does he do? What does he do next? And here he is on a train going somewhere. We do not know where he's going, but we know he's on a train, we know he's going somewhere, and we know that the world continues to be shit. He's in a train that has steel mesh over the windows, and there's violence outside. And the scene continues on. He's just sitting there looking shell-shocked out the window, while there are these two cops that tell you this whole story about how dangerous the world is, and this character, Rick's boy, has gone through all this trouble, and they talk about the different gangs that exist in the world, while they pop some pills, and you realize, this world is really subsiding on alcohol and pills, okay, fair enough. And they continue on talking about these stories. They end with giving one piece of crucial information, which is to say, well, at least England is still alive. The rest of the world is like shit, but and it's hell out there, but at least we are, we are set apart. Now, just from what I've described and you glancing at the scene, can you tell a problem with this scene?
Too much dialogue?
Too much dialogue, and what does that do? Well,
Exposition.
exposition, but exposition about what? You know, it talks about a world that we have already seen in turmoil. It brings in two characters we're never going to see before. And they talk about Rick's son. Who the fuck cares about Rick's son? We're never going to see him. So, and while your main character is just sitting, staring out the window. So you kind of want to ask, well, what am I doing with this scene? What am I using this scene for? And if I'm building on information, where's the build-up? If I'm using it for a little interlude, it should be much shorter. So questioning the use of language and the use of language for giving information that sounds good, but really the question is, what is the intent? What is it really being used for? And moving on, our character leaves the train, arrives at the train station. There's one little line about policemen patrolling the platform, some with German shepherds. So there's a sense of a police state all around. And here comes Jasper, lovely introduction of a man who is larger than life and will not let this horrible situation put him down. And we get an understanding of friendship, but there isn't really much going on. It's just the first interaction. And then we enter a whole sequence, which starts on page 4 and continues all the way until page 7. So 3 scenes in the car, I believe, back to back, where Theo is basically sitting there and Jasper is talking. And the thing that is accomplished is you really get a sense for Jasper's voice. There's a playfulness. This is a guy who will make a joke out of anything. This is how he survives. And he also infuses the piece with some incredibly necessary humor. The first little scene is interesting to look at because it is a classic example of flat writing. Jasper asks Theo, many got killed. Theo says, I don't know, fuck, the place was packed. Who set the bomb? Fuck knows. My ears are still ringing. All of this is information we know. We've seen it. We've seen that the place was packed. We've seen that a lot of people were hurt. There's an echo of that visually in the prior scene. So all of this is wasted space. There's one little thing at the very end where Jasper identifies the piercing sound that hurts Theo's ears after the bomb, and he says, "You mean that E?" And continues sort of mocking it. And by that, what do we understand? We understand that this is a world where this is normal. You know, Jasper has been in a situation like that. Everybody has been in a situation like that. It's like a known thing. So that is an interesting detail because it adds an element of understanding to the world. We know that that bomb was not the only bomb to worry about. And then the second sort of little segment of the scene continues on. And again, it's the same kind of premise of, Jasper says, well, what did you do? Theo says, he left. Okay, we know he left. He talks about the bloody woman he's seen. Again, we've seen it. So there isn't really anything exciting or interesting until the very bottom of the page where Jasper again has this little glimpse of expression of character where he's joking and he's basically saying, I'm glad I didn't lose you together with baby Diego, that would be too much to bear. And there's an irony and a playfulness in that really defines the character, and I would dare say that if we were to hold on to something, that would be a moment to look at. Piece continues on. It continues on sort of like, again, with the playfulness of who baby Diego was. But again, through all of this, there isn't quite, that theoretically there is a friendship, but there isn't really space for playing with that idea. There is the marking of it, which again is very much a quality of an early draft. You're marking your territory. You say two friends in a car talking about how bad things are. Okay. Well, but how do we know they're friends unless there is something intimate and playful within that interaction that makes it more specific? And then there is an interesting moment in that last segment, the third repeated car scene, where there's an action that gives us a new piece of information. It's 3/4 down the page. They're driving and they stop, and there's actually these bushes that they have to clear in order to get to the house. And That's useful because there's an action in the scene, so you're breaking the monotony of the driving. You're also telling the audience they're going to a hideout. They're going to a place that is hidden from just everyday traffic. And this again highlights a bit more in a different way the danger of the world and how secluded and isolated these people are. But through that whole scene, Jasper, the only thing he does is he tells a joke. And the function of a joke is to introduce the concept of the human project, which is some sort of humanitarian organization, very nice, and to again emphasize the fact that he is a joker and that he jokes about awful things, and that he has a way of doing that. Now, what you'll see is interesting when we go and look at the film is that it's a very funny joke, it works, but right now, in the way that it's placed, it's dead, because it's not doing anything, it's just told while they're moving some bushes. You'll see how in the rewrite of the film, the joke is still very intact, but placed in a different scene and for a completely different purpose. It has a purpose in terms of bonding the characters as opposed to just introducing an idea. And then the last part of the sequence, before we get to Jasper's house, is used for contrast and for change. It changes the mood because Theo introduces the fact that there is a woman named Janice, and we understand that this is Jasper's thorn. This is his pain, this is his problem, it's his wife, and she's in trouble. There is something wrong with her. The problem with the scene is that once he tells us this, we understand this, and then right after we get introduced to her and we get an echo of what we've already learned in a way. So again, that's a place to notice and to examine, because there isn't really enough shift between the telling of the trouble and watching it in movement. So Janice, the elderly wife, is introduced, and so is this wall of photographs that gives a sense of her life, and she's sort of lost in the past. So okay, we mark her, she's a character lost in the past for some reason. And this is Jasper's weakness. This is his Achilles heel, is his care for this woman and the issues he has with her condition. Moving on, then there's a section between Jasper and Theo where Jasper continues to tell stories. And he tells another story about how he met this refugee guy in the forest, and he had gone through hell escaping from what we learn is a concentration camp in the area. And Jasper says, I wish I could help him, basically, but all these immigrants and refugees, they're in really deep, deep trouble because the UK government, in order to keep some semblance of quiet and order, kills these people as they roam the countryside looking for asylum, basically. So he uses yet another story to put forth very valid points, that there's a danger in the world, that there are immigrant issues, and that there is this place, Bexhill, which is nearby, which is crucial plot-wise, because this is where Theo will end up from the middle of the film on, and this is where his transformation is going to take place. And it's introduced in the middle of this storytelling. And continuing on, Jasper theoretically keeps trying to open up his friend, offers him some pot, Theo says no. And Jasper again goes into another story about how he got the pot and how the guards at this Bexhill place are actually providing him with this, etc., 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 and isn't the world going to shit? And Theo's only offer in that whole interaction is to say, yeah, the dinosaurs had a pretty good run of it, but now it's our turn, and you know what? So be it. What are you going to do? So he shows up as a cynic, and that's really all there is to it. And the sequence ends with Theo revisiting Janice, so it's almost like a little bookmark of a thing. And he takes the hairbrush she's holding, brushes her hair, and in that moment his eye wanders, and in the pictures that she's looking at, he recognizes himself as a young man, sees this woman and this kid, there's a sense of activism, and there's a clear sense, okay, there is a past and there's a problem with the past. Okay, so let's stop here for a second and examine this first, this sequence up to here. This is the sequence that I broke down in the outline. So if you think of the way that I've been talking about it and the facts, sort of the actions that we already know have happened. And if you even look at the blackened one-liners within the outline, you will identify immediately the main issue with this first draft. He doesn't do a thing. He puts whiskey in his coffee, he takes a train, and he brushes a woman's hair. Lovely, 11 minutes. We don't really know much about this guy. And the question is, if this whole premise, if this whole film depends on the awakening of a hero, I really don't believe this guy has any bone of a hero in his body. So, and I really don't believe that he's going to be able to maneuver the kind of situation that the film is going to give him. The problem is that, you know, one can say, okay, well, but then he awakens and he really discovers this hit. But we don't believe it. You don't believe it because you haven't seen it. You haven't seen the seed, you haven't seen the wing, and you don't like him because there's nothing to like, because he's not doing anything, he's listening. The world is falling apart and he just listens. So this is the main issue of the draft. We learn his job, we sort of emphasize the fact that yes, it has a global effect. We emphasize that it's really, he doesn't care. And then he takes advantage of the situation. So what do you learn about him? He uses things. He's a maneuverer. He's sleek. And that's exactly right. So that's what he has to do in the story. So in this little microcosm of the problem, he exhibits the exact characteristic that is going to be crucial for him to survive the film and to fulfill the promise that he takes on as an action in the film. So in opposition to how the draft works, he's given a skill, which is a psychological skill and a behavioral skill, but a skill nonetheless that he's then going to have to use. And then we cut to the train where instead of the chit-chat, you'll see, the only thing we see is this big screen with we can start playing again, with the different cities of the world being tossed in. Right? The idea of a woman in his life. And why is that important?
The wife is coming back.
Because the wife is coming back, and the wife is going to give him the call of adventure, and you need to know what his emotional space is so that you can understand what role she plays upon re-entry. Because you don't want to wonder if he's got a girlfriend at home, and you don't want to wonder if he cares or he doesn't care. You realize he cares, you realize he's alone, and you realize that there's an emotional vacuum in this area of his life, so that when she shows up, you have an open space for her to re-enter and use that space and manipulate him, and for him to start having a response that we understand because we have been pre-informed about the situation. And then this last little bit, instead of just being used about Janice and whether or not she's, you know, distraught or not, again gives a little more of a touch of an emotional thing. It was his birthday and he didn't do anything. He got up depressed, he went to bed depressed. So again, it infuses him not with passivity. Even in moments where there isn't specific action, there's a very clear sense of emotion. There isn't a flatness, there's an emotional explanation, an emotional positioning. So he's been able to relax, he's been able to bond, we know that this is home for him, so the positioning of the situation is quite clear, and all the information that we learn through the storytelling is there, but it's there in much more economical, visual kind of ways, through the bus, and through the way that he moves through the train station in order to get to Jasper, and the way that the Jasper's house is treated, etc., etc. And we have this incredibly important new element of information, which is number one, that he's a maneuverer, and number two, that he has a love hole in his life. I'm going to go through and run through the draft for the rest of the pages to get to that meeting with Julian, because that's a crucial change in the script. But basically, after he goes home, in the script we have a scene in the apartment, which is relatively the same but much more economical in the film. Again, with a TV voice about how international this whole crisis is, etc., etc. You see how it's done with images again, and then he goes out into the street. Fair enough, we are expecting something new. And what we get, if you look on page 12, is suddenly Theo pontificating. pontificating, philosophizing. There's a use of voiceovers. We track him through the city, and then he goes to a university. And then he gives a lecture as a history professor about the moment where the past and the future meet, and there's the tip of both cones, and he talks about hope. He tries to talk about hope, and in the draft, this is his profession. And if you think of how they solved the issue of the profession in the film, it is so much more applicable to this character, because if you're starting with a man who is dead into the world, how on earth do you justify the fact that he is someone who shows up teaching day after day after day after day to an audience of what is intended in the script to be bums and people who just pee on the seats of the auditorium. So you see here the change already as the draft of the film handles. And then after that, she goes out. So you have his little sort of lonely soliloquy there. And then he goes out into the street. He's looking at a book by Stephen King. I don't know who would really pay attention to the title of this book, but okay, fair attempt. And then he gets kidnapped, and there's an action sequence. It's actually pretty similar in the script, that last little part. He gets kidnapped, and here we enter the very, very crucial moment of meeting Julian, middle of first act. One can say that the inciting incident of the film is the death of baby Diego. This is the first major complication. Or one could say, again, because there are different ways of thinking about the same things, that this is the inciting incident in his life, because this is the thing that really changes his world. And all the rest is basically a setup of a universe and a setup of a character that leads him to this moment. So let's pay a little bit of attention to this and this interrogation. He is hooded, and there are these voices. They take off the hood, and we understand that he's under the jurisdiction of this group that is called the Five Fishes. And there is a woman's voice that questions the need for restraint. And when she's told that yes, it's necessary, she's defiant. So she's presented as a boss just by her behavior. Theo is still from the position of not knowing who this woman is. She approaches, she's wearing a mask, and she gives him a line that makes him understand that they are connected somehow. But she approaches in a mask, and she unmasks herself, and in unmasking herself, he realizes that he is his wife, which we'll find out in a second, that he thought was dead. His first response is he recovers with a smirk. Now think about that for a second. Huh? Smirk is sort of like an annoyed smile. Huh. Now, in this world of death and life, and in this world where he has thought his wife has been dead, his first response is a smirk. It's a little bit small, and it's a little bit off. It's off psychologically, because you need to stay connected to a character whose experience you're identifying with, and this is such a detached emotional response that whatever you've gained up to this point, you lose. And then it gets better, because this woman who was dead, according to what her husband believed for all these years, and who is the leader of this group, we have established that, goes on and gives a story. Again, this draft it has the curse of stories, which is fascinating because it's fine. It's an exercise of what has to be discovered. But then you see how all of them are chopped and tossed out, because they just let the piece, and they often are completely not authentic emotionally. So she tells a story, and she tells a story about how she met Theo and how they were both part of this anti-globalization demonstration thing, etc., etc., etc. And they share a little laugh in the middle of this kidnapping situation. He has no idea what he's been kidnapped, by the way, but he laughs. And he asks for his flask, fair enough. I would ask for my flask. And then she goes on with the story to tell the team of her cohorts and these people that she's the leader of about how she and Theo tied themselves naked as demonstrators on this statue. And the whole thing becomes a joke because they messed up and it didn't really have any effect, and etc., etc. Now, what kind of leader would put in their minds of her followers herself naked, tied on a statue? I don't know. But apparently she does. So then we continue, and there is this sense of banter between them. So she has theoretically, in the logic of this draft, shared all these stories to remind him of their past and therefore make him open up. And then she says the obvious, I need your help. Again, the curse of death, announcing a goal way too out there without really allowing us to discover what the issue is. And then comes the second part of the scene. You'll see that in the film, the scene also comes in two parts, but they're incredibly different in emotional value. The second part comes, and his first line is "Death suits you." So again, there is a cynical and an edginess to him that completely does not engage the emotion and the weight of the moment. Then there's an explanation that she basically faked her death in order to be able to avoid the police and go into hiding and continue being able to be an activist. And then he basically says, I need an exit visa for a girl, and why don't you use your friend, Mr. Teddy, who is the Minister of Culture, and he has clout. Now, one small thing to notice here is that she gives him an assist. She says, go to Mr. X. And she calls on a friend. In the film, you'll see it's a cousin.
It's a cousin.
So again, it's the principle of bringing things closer, bringing things more intimate, even when it comes down to small decisions like that. And then when he says, forget about it, he'll never do it, she pulls up the backstory card. Bad idea. She brings out the backstory card and says, you know what? This girl's 21, and our boy would have been 21, and Theo says that's low, and in fact it really is. And then she says, well, this is how strongly I feel. I never asked you for anything else before, did I? And the last line of this incredibly powerful scene, in theory, is Theo knows that she hasn't really asked him for anything like that. So, the intent of the scene is there. The intent of the scene is he gets kidnapped, he gets to reconnect with his ex-wife, he gets to be shocked by her presence, he's given a task, and pause, he has a response to that. But the way that the scene runs emotionally completely fake when you actually look at the circumstances these two people are in, and because of that, it steals. It doesn't allow the piece to go as far as it would emotionally if they were actually allowed to connect in a more true way. Now, what is interesting is that you don't have the pages in front of you, but the piece continues on, and the way that the way that the plot continues in the draft is to create a situation where he basically gets pushed into accepting the mission. But in the film, the reason he really accepts and the steps he takes towards accepting mainly have to do with emotion. They mainly have to do with the fact that she has come back and he's really taken by it. Yeah.
Yeah, but anyway, what kind of wife is that? She has disappeared. She hasn't let him know that she's alive. And the first time she meets him, she asks her something.
Well, she's a woman who has a higher calling than her family. So, and this is, and him, right, correct. And in the film, I'm pretty sure he says, how come? How come you didn't?
Well,
right? That's right. And you see because you want to ask, like, what has separated these people? And you realize in the film that it's two different ideologies. and two different ways of dealing with trauma. And in the film, you're given enough space to build that in order to understand it, in order to understand that he opens up to her, in order to be devastated by the outcome, in order for him to really have no choice other than to accept the mission. Because right now, this relationship is pretty non-existent. So there is no way that her force would cause him to shift this whole pattern that we've seen existing so far. Rewrite that they did at whatever point they did that, they made that relationship be full of emotion, and they kept it anchored on them until the moment she dies. Just to give you a few other shifts from in that long, beautiful scene in the car. First of all, she was not driving. There was no love banter between them, partly because there was no scene prior on the bus for the opening of the possibility, and there was no moment for him to say what happens to us after, and there was no moment for a kiss. So there was not a precondition for a love scene in the car of any sort. And what was going on was that Luke was driving, she was there, and then they started asking him these logistical questions about whether or not he knew about the activists and the human project and all that. And it was during that question and answer thing that the car came and stopped them, which creates a completely different scene, because there is no emotion, there is no tragedy. And the other thing that is incredibly different is the scene after the burial. In the script, they bury her, and he enters this conversation with Miriam. He says, "Is she dead?" And Miriam, the older woman, says, "Yes, but she died for a cause." And he's sort of standing there, and that's it. There's absolutely no emotion. As opposed to this moment, which is he's completely, if there's a moment of nakedness, this is a moment of nakedness. He's just stripped raw to the bone. There's no need for any language, and you see him like you've never seen before, and you want to be with him for the rest of the film. There's no escaping his fate. So end of the act, point of no return for him emotionally, because now he's stripped raw, and now he can go on into the journey. And let's just look at this next little sequence of the first complication of the second act, which is the revelation of what this whole issue of the transit papers is about, and who is this girl in the back of the car.
Quite a surprise.
And let me just pause for a second before we go in to say that the difference in the script is again a difference of overriding and using language instead of emotion. The girl sells him on the idea of why he should do what he has to do and help her, because she quotes Julian. So the stuff that Julian said in the bus, which was so powerful between them about their past and about dealing with their son, is told through this witness to him after her death, a completely different effect.
Jesus Christ.
This is the first big sequence of the film, up to the moment of revelation and up to the moment where this guy now is faced with quite a choice. Is he going to be able to fulfill what Julian wanted him to do? There's an added complication that moves on in the next sequence, because these other guys are not as benevolent as they seem. They have their own idea of how to deal with this pregnant woman and use her as a pawn for their own political schemes. So he has to basically kidnap her and run. And then for the rest of the film, he's running. But the reason that we believe and we go with it is because there's so much emotion built up in this last 20 minutes that we've been following him and his beginning of awakening with his ex-wife, which, if we go back to the whole premise of what was problematic in terms of the draft, was nowhere to be seen in the script. So you see how plot-wise the script is, it moves. It's exactly the same thing. But the plot doesn't hold, because emotionally there is no truth underneath it. And yet the plot didn't have to change. There were only a few scenes that were added, but what really, really changed was the emotional connection with the character and his ability to behave in order to make us believe that he had the capacity to do something larger than life. So God bless, Godspeed, and good luck with your projects. Any questions?
Yeah, fantastic. I think very often when we approach a script, we have to film this sort, I don't know how to express it, but there's a part of the story that is very little, and there's a part where the story that is very big. And then if you see a movie like this, we're about 40 minutes into the story of 110 minutes film. Definitely, when you summarize the story, it's the story of Theo getting this pregnant girl to some sort of, we don't even know where, to some sort of salvation, no? And yet this thing starts 40 minutes into the movie. And I think that sometimes, very often, you forget that stories have to be set up. And you get very, very easy on your setting up, like giving things for granted, or characters for granted, situations, circumstances. And actually, you know, the first act break is a sort of dual, because to him, emotionally, it's the death of the wife.
Yeah.
To the story, it's the
The
discovery
story
of
is
the
the
pregnant
discovery of the
girl.
girl, that's exactly
See, it's very tricky. It's you really, sometimes you really have to be careful about this sort of dual life of the story, the character's arc, and in the story, in the narrative.
Absolutely, and again, it's always a question of percentages and weight, as you started
And
saying.
of course, the two things get together.
Yeah, the two things get together because it's a sequence where one thing causes the other, but in essence, the core movement of the piece is his emotional awakening. So the first turn is his emotional turn, so that the plot turn could happen.
And the nice thing is he has to be killed in a way emotionally.
Right, exactly, to be reborn.
And he's
be able
reborn
to-
in the next sequence. It's very elegant.
But it's very weird because if we know she trusts him, and we know it straight from the beginning, if she had shown him the pregnant woman in minute 15, he would say yes. I mean, he's in awe. He wouldn't say no. But he doesn't do that because why?
There's no opening. There is this whole edginess of like, oh my God, I thought you were, and you are in this crazy activist world, and I'm just killing myself by smoking, and thank God you're alive, but quite honestly, he has to open up little by little, because you see the danger is that and we often do that as writers, you know where you want to get him, and you get him there too fast. But the journey and the excitement, what makes it not boring, is the step-by-step transformation that starts with the pettiness of the character. He needs the money for the gambling, and then moves and moves and moves and moves until it becomes about life and death. If it had been a thing about life and death, it would have been too easy. It would have been too fast, and it would have been not satisfying.
And just, I'm adding, and if you ask yourself, why do you need to have Julian die in the story? Because otherwise he will not make it. And you need something that has to be traded, and otherwise he doesn't have reason to do it. Otherwise
He needs a life and death promise, and it's only through her death that he gets that, and it's only through her death that he has the life force to actually push ahead. Because he can't bear to lose another person. He's lost the son.
Yeah, the dead son also.
That's right. He's lost the son. He's losing the wife. In the next sequence, after he kidnaps her, he's going to lose Jasper, because Jasper is going to sacrifice for him. Together with his wife, he's going to kind of delay the approach of the antagonists. So he's losing everybody. And who does he have left? He's left. He has the soulful moral mission left, which is the echo of all of these people, and that's why he keeps going, and that's why we like him. And lying to himself. There's something incredibly satisfying about characters lying to themselves. You see, as you said, like the moment he sees her, and the way that it's done in the film, he sees that apparition. I mean, how can he resist this angel coming back from the dead? The dead. He can't resist. But of course, at the beginning he does, because it's too much to compute. And in the beginning, he uses the sort of like, he tells himself a lie, I'm doing it for the money. And we know it's a lie, we know that he's doing it for her, but we're sort of going along with his little opening, and we believe him, because we all do that. We so rarely do we jump into adventure. We always test it, we always say, well, I'm really doing it for this, but I'm not really, And then, eventually, once you're further in it, there's nowhere to hide. But in the beginning, there's something incredibly satisfying about him hiding and us kind of knowing.
I also wanted to ask, because I'm wondering, how come that the pregnancy is in the second act, that it's not like seen in the first act? Because it's a story of Theo, of transition of Theo, and it's not really the story about this girl, right? But I mean, if this story is about saving this lady. How come it's not in the first act? And
Okay, but it's about saving your own life, your own psychic, your own reason, raison d'être, your own like actual life by saving a life. And I would argue that she exists in echo in the first act, because there is the mention of the dead son. There's the child that you want to save and you couldn't have saved, and this whole thing has fucked your life. And now it manifests itself in the tangibility of the woman described.
And you could actually see the first act ending also here, depending on what
Right.
arc you're looking at. I think there is a dual turning point, as you were saying. There's a turning point that has to be with his inner self, which has to do with the death of Julian, and then there's a more external plot theme, which is the theme of somehow, that represents the theme of the movie, that has to do with the girl and saving the girl. So that's why one comes straight after the other. I mean, you couldn't separate them further, because then you would feel there's something wrong.
And plus, really think of the surprise, because you probably would not expect
Yeah, sure.
that you had, and it's like,
And it completely re-energizes the film.
And it brings the
It
story
brings the
forward.
energy way back up. And
Otherwise, what it will do now? It will return to London. Now,
Right.
the story.
Yeah,
Right,
sure,
and
of
go
course, of
kill
course.
himself, I would suggest.
Yeah.
That's what
With
Yeah.
Kratos.
right. So that's right. But so you also want to be careful where you're going to position your hot energy points.
Yeah.
So if you're going to deplete the story, which is what happens with Julian, you also have to re-energize it. You have to give it a huge push so that it keeps going.
And if you know in the beginning, in the first half hour, that there's a pregnant girl somewhere, you will never get the energy that you have here, because it's sort of predictable.
It will be a
has an
letdown.
agenda.
It's like, okay,
And
yeah,
sometimes, either some project I had today, you all have energy in the story, inside the story, and immediate, not that you're not, but the first choice is to go for the safest, lay down all the elements, while, when an element is played down at the full of its energy and it's discovered, it just gives a huge thrust to the story, rather than a sort of a continuous step-by-step movement. No?
Yeah, and also this turning point really works as a big surprise, also because it has a meaning, because you've had half an hour of sitting up, the world has come to an end, there's no more people there, there's infertility, baby.
So he's ripe for the information, because there's no escaping it.
And the audience too is
And the audience too
it's
is
just ready to take this as a huge reveal, because you are in the world of the film by now.
Yeah, so basically it's a story about surviving, right?
Yeah, but surviving the right way.
Yeah, survival through understanding the meaning of life.
So surviving through allowing humanity to survive, not through surviving yourself.
Theo? 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 Theo! The boat! The boat! It's okay. We're safe now. We're safe. Baby,